I remember quite vividly the first Sunday that I walked into a Unitarian Universalist congregation. They met in the afternoons at about 4 o'clock. They were a lay-led congregation, had no minister, about 30 to 40 people gathered in the back room of the Presbyterian church across the street from my college. I had made a decision at the invitation of a professor to come and visit for the first time, although I was hesitant. You see, I didn't go to church. I had not gone to church in a while, and I was really not excited about the idea, but I was curious enough, and so I stepped in that day. Some of you were there that day that are here. That's amazing. And I remember that I was kind of blown away. It was Earth Day. I was welcomed in. They were doing a thing called Flower Communion, kind of a visible representation of the unique community that we create out of our different parts. And we sang For All That Is Our Life, the hymn that we sang this morning, and I found myself really confused. Well, how am I enjoying this? I don't like church. You mean not everybody, they're going to tell me what I'm supposed to think? What's going on here? And I was a little skeptical, and I kept coming back, and looking back on that day, I had no idea that walking through those doors was going to have such a profound impact on my future. I didn't know right then, and probably would have been a bad idea had I known right then the change that would occur in my life after visiting that day. But I remember thinking there was something special about that place. Something special about a place that allowed me to sing out hymns of praise and gratitude, but allowed me to come with all of my questions, that didn't ask me to forget about my past experience, some of my cynicism, but said to me, "You are a uniquely formed child of the universe. Get to work." So I came back. I'm imagining that there are a few of you, at least today, for whom this is the first time you've entered into our church, or the first few times. Maybe in 15 years you'll look back and see just as dramatic an impact has had on me, but I think it's important for us to revisit every so often the place where you're sitting today. Where do we come from? What are our basic values? Who and what are we called to be in the world? So every August, we kind of go back to the drawing board and say, remember, this is important about who we are. Last week, Reverend Dana started us off by giving us a little insight about the Unitarians in our heritage. And while this isn't a history lesson, it is important to know where you're at. Our faith is the marriage of two liberal Christian traditions of the past, which got married in 1961. They merged. The Unitarians, on the one hand, who were liberal Christians that believed that there was no Trinity. Unitarian. They thought God was one, that Jesus was a human teacher. They said that instead of human beings being inherently sinful at birth, we were born inherently good. In fact, they thought that we were so good that something of God moved and breathed in us. William Ellery Channing, one of the ministers who really was the first person to call what we were doing Unitarian Christianity, preached about what he called a likeness to God that is in us. The Unitarians thought that, and I'm making gross generalizations here, but the Unitarians thought that God kind of rested in human beings and our capacity to reason. For a lot of them, religion happened from the neck up. We used our reason in Scripture. We thought smart things. We had good ideas, and therefore that was evidence of the holy moving and breathing in us. They didn't have a creed, but they did have shared beliefs. And on some of their church walls in the 1800s and into the early 1900s, it would say, and this is their old language, "We believe in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the leadership of Jesus, salvation by character, and the progress of humankind onward and upward forever." They believed we were good and things were getting better. These are people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, John and Abigail Adams, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. People like that, a lot of the people who helped form our country. On the other hand, on the other side, at the same time, mostly in America we're talking about, there was this group of Christians called the Universalists. Universalists believed that no loving God would ever condemn a part of creation to hell. They thought about God mostly as a loving parent figure. And their logic was pretty simple. Could you send your child to hell forever? If not, and God supposedly is far more wise, forgiving, compassionate, powerful, etc. than us, how could God do that to God's children? If the Unitarians were the urban, intellectual, wealthy elite of the Northeast, then the broad generalization about the Universalists is that they were the rural, less educated, circuit-riding, God loves you and there's nothing you can do about it preachers. They would hold tent revivals and say that. The idea was so controversial that they weren't allowed to serve on juries in Massachusetts for a long time. The idea was that if you didn't believe you went to hell if you did something bad, we can't trust you to make moral judgments about religion. There was a guy named Hosea Ballou who got ordained without knowing he was going to be ordained. He was at a Universalist convention, and a famous preacher came up and grabbed a Bible and held it to Hosea Ballou's chest and said, "We are ordaining you today." He became one of the most influential Universalists. He wrote this book called A Treatise on Atonement. Basically what it said was, it makes no sense for an infinite God to infinitely punish finite people for making finite mistakes. Basically, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Yeah? And he said that in the relationship between God and humans, God is not the dissatisfied party. Right? So for him, the whole point of religion is turned around. You don't have to do something special to get God to love you. You don't have to pray a certain way or go to the right religious community. You don't have to be the right color skin or the right gender or have the right thoughts to get God to love you. That'll never stop. Our job is to fall back in love with life and with God, he said. That's why religion existed. So those two groups became a little more like one another as time went on. Universalists in the early 1900s were painting pictures of the cosmos on some of their church ceilings and debating whether or not they were even a Christian church anymore. If Christianity wasn't the primary mechanism to find God, then why could you have an only Christian community? In fact, their symbol for a long time was an off-centered cross in a circle, which meant we're Christians, but you don't have to be. We're not the center of the universe. So those two groups became more progressive, more liberal over time, meaning that they searched for truth in many places and believed that human beings were responsible for creating justice and love on earth. In the 1950s, the teenagers from both of those groups merged. The youth group of the Unitarians and the youth group of the Universalists nationally became one thing. And the older people followed suit 10 years afterward. And the adults in the Unitarians and the adults in the Universalists merged in May of 1961 to become the tradition that you're looking at today. I tell people that today we believe that people experience what we call God in many ways, that all people are worthy of love and justice without exception, and that religion's not about what happens when you die, but rather how we build a loving world here on earth. Now, we're still related to our liberal Christian ancestors, but just like how we're related to some of our ancestors from the past, we're not only them. We still have the Bible, but now we use the Hubble telescope and the teachings of the Buddha and the Quran. We study the New York Times and astrophysics. We're looking for truth about how to live a good and decent life wherever we can find it. I love the Universalists. I really like them and their character. I like the Unitarians too, but the Universalists get forgotten every so often. If the Unitarians were kind of the staid, intellectual people, the religion that Ralph Waldo Emerson called corpse cold before he left it, then the Universalists were the evangelicals of their vision. They were, and I'm making big broad strokes here, they were passionate, emotional preachers and teachers. They believed that the one way to ruin a minister was to send him to theological school. I'm using him at that time. They loved a quick wit. They thought that preachers and teachers should be able to improvise. They liked telling a good joke. They would travel across the country, often in covered wagons, preaching the unending love of God to anybody who would listen. This guy, John Murray, who was one of the first Universalists preaching in the United States, was once said to be preaching in his congregation in Gloucester, Massachusetts, when a rock flew through the pulpit, through the stained glass window, and landed on the pulpit next to him. And it said that without skipping a beat, he reached down and picked up the rock and showed it to the congregation and said, "This argument is solid and weighty, but it is not reasonable nor convincing." That same preacher, who was said to preach in everyday language for everyday people, was on a boat with John and Abigail Adams once, the Unitarians. And they listened to him preach, because back in the day, if there was a minister on a boat, they asked you to preach. They don't do that anymore, but they used to. And so he is preaching on this boat. And John and Abigail Adams are listening to the sermon, and she writes to a friend that it was this kind of pedestrian language, this normal people kind of language. She likes a sermon that reads better, she said. So there was that difference between them. Hosea Ballou, that young influential preacher, went around talking about a loving parent figure. Now, there were social implications of that gospel. This is not just a history lesson. They were faced, like in the reading that Reverend Cantor read to us this morning, with the idea that if you really believed that all of us equally share in the world's goodness, that each and every one of us has the same cosmic worth, that we are all loved in the same way by a loving God, however you say it. If you really believe that, can you ever live the same afterward? Can you wake up on Sunday morning and hear a sermon about God's unending love or all creation sharing in the holy, and then go into the world on Monday morning and act the way we so often act? So they had social implications. One of them was about race and slavery. See, they thought if slaves and slaveholders, when they die, are going to be equal partners in participating with God for all eternity, we ought better get to acting like we're equal right now. If men and women are going to be equal co-creators with God for all eternity, we had better get to acting like we are equal right now, etc., etc. So the Universalists, even by the 1790s, were issuing statements as a denomination about abolition of slavery. The country had only been informed for a couple of decades, and they were already on the forefront of that issue. They also believed that women should be ordained fully into the ministry. The first woman who was ordained by a denomination in the United States was Olympia Brown, a Universalist. She's a cool person. We'll talk about her later in the year. One of the only suffragettes to ever live long enough to vote. She would travel in a covered wagon throughout Kansas preaching about equality for women while people threw things and spat at her, but it didn't stop her. They worked in labor unions. Remember, the idea is that if religion doesn't exist to get people into heaven, then religion exists to get heaven into people. They were actually pretty active in temperance movement. We don't talk about that much. And Texas was a hotbed of Universalism. That's a forgotten fact. There were Universalist churches all over Texas. In fact, Hico, Texas was a center of Universalism. Yeah. Let's go remind them. So, you should know that in Texas in the 1800s, the Texas Universalist Convention, I learned this through Daniel Polk, one of our members here, told me that in the late 1800s, the Texas Universalists were working on legislation for equal pay for women. 1800s. So basically, the idea goes like this: can you hear that we are all equal children of a loving God, or all equal children in a vast, mysterious universe, and ever live your life the same way again? They said no. You can't. Now, even though they are not around in the same way they were before, we have now taken them in. They were desperately worried they were going to get eaten up in the merger, that people would forget about them. And, to be honest, we kind of worship the way Unitarians did, and some of the signs out front like ours don't say Universalist on them. It was true. They did kind of get eaten up. At one time, they were the 5th biggest denomination in the United States. And yet, as the Methodists started preaching less about hell, the Presbyterians weren't as fire and brimstone, and the Episcopalians gave up that kind of talk years ago. They kind of lost their edge. But I don't think that we're done wrestling with the kind of issues that they wrestled with. You tell me we don't still wonder why bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people, and why we worry that people get off scot-free when they hurt us, and why there's not justice in the world, and some of us secretly, myself included, harbor a desire that they're gonna get theirs? You telling me that we still don't stare in the mirror from time to time and wonder if we are not unlovable, unworthy, forgotten by the force that created the universe? I think some of us in the room, if we're still admitting it, might be afraid of a God we no longer believe in. I remember distinctly being in middle school, calling a friend of mine on the phone. Her name was Hannah, and I was telling her about my shifting religious ideas. I told her I wasn't believing in God anymore, and yet I was afraid that the God I no longer believed in was going to send me to hell. Made sense. I don't think we've stopped wrestling with those ideas. But today in our church, this merger of the Unitarians with their notion that you are born good and holy right in this skin on this earth, the Universalists who believe that every single person deserves the same love of the biggest entity we can imagine. We still can't believe these things and ever act the same way again. For us, you can't affirm that anything you can do, say, think, buy, beg, borrow, or steal is going to make you more worthy than anybody else. You can't vote for a candidate that makes you more worthy than anybody else. You can't be smarter than someone and be more worthy. You can't be richer or better looking or healthier or anything else that makes you more worthy than anybody else. And any illusion you've ever had that you are less worthy than someone else is a falsehood of cosmic proportions. Today, we also affirm, just like they did, that we cannot hoard God. That we cannot selfishly hold on to all that is good. Some people spell God with 2 O's. That we cannot hoard what makes life healed and whole. Once we discover it, we had better well share it with others. And so today, our salvation is not the idea that one God, a cosmos away, saved all people and everything is fine. But rather that if we discover that something makes life whole, if we find out that compassion saved your life, then we had better cooperate with compassion until everybody has it. If you find out that love saved your life or safety saved your life, that tolerance and inclusion saved your life, then we have a moral imperative to make sure that every single human being partakes in that saving reality. Because anything that saves, anything that makes life whole belongs to everyone. So maybe it's your first Sunday. Maybe you've been around for 50 years or longer. But I hope you find in this place that the call is to identify what forces make life whole, and how can we make sure that all people equally have access to them. How can we participate in the healing of the world? May it be so. Amen.